What's up, guys? Justin Morgan here, and today I want to talk to you about the topic of the squat versus the deadlift and the way that they generate fatigue. There was and also kind of cover some topics on training and how that might apply to different types of training, or how you might be able to tie that to your training. I'm going to give you an example of how I'm experimenting with this research and with using the ideas from the studies that I'm going to reference in this. This came out of Mass magazine, and they did a research study, or they wrote on the topic of the research study. The article was by Dr. Mike Zordos, and he was basically looking at fatigue that is generated from the squat versus fatigue that is generated from the deadlift. In previous times, most coaches have generally regarded the deadlift as being more difficult to recover from than the squat. So generally in programs that you see, like beginner up through intermediate programs, you'll typically see that the deadlift is programmed less frequently than you would generally see the squat to be programmed into a lifter's training week. So this video will kind of cover the research. It'll discuss the studies that were conducted, and then it'll of course discuss at the end some modifications on how I will personally be, or have been over the past week, using this in my training. So I would imagine the video will probably be about 10 minutes or so. I'm going to try to get through it without a whole lot of useless information being covered. So the overall findings that are stated in the study, I'm going to be reading from it here, is that both high-intensity squats and high-intensity deadlifts cause fatigue, but little difference was found between the two and how much fatigue was generated. The key words to consider in this that I'll cover again later is high intensity, meaning that they were doing them for a high percentage of total intensity. So they were like using 95% of their squat or 95% of their deadlift to generate fatigue in the study. So there are several factors that are significant to this study that they couldn't have covered because there's just too much to try to pack into it. When these studies are done, typically what will happen is that they'll look to isolate variables down to something that you can draw data from. If you have a ton of different factors going into the study, then it makes it impossible to compare some of those things. So a second finding was that the study, second aspect of the study was this: it utilized well-trained lifters with a squat max of around 160 kilograms and a deadlift max of around 190. So we're talking like 365 to 400 pounds as the max is. Not world class, but for people that have been training for several years, those are pretty normal, moderate numbers. So, and then number 3, the study provides excellent insight into acute fatigue caused by high-intensity squatting and high-intensity deadlifting. However, we do not know if the same results would be found for high-volume hypertrophy type training. So if you're utilizing reps of, say, 6 to 10 or 8 to 12, whatever, that may not, the findings of this study may not be applicable in the same way. So there may be more fatigue generated from one versus the other. This study did not look at that. It looked specifically at high intensity, low rep training. Prior to conducting the study, the authors hypothesized that the magnitude of both fatigue and the endocrine response would be greater after the deadlift session compared to the squat session. So, like most coaches that have wrote programs and worked with athletes, they believed prior to the study that the deadlift would be more fatiguing than the squat. Research questions that were covered or that were looked to be answered in the study was: does acute central, peripheral, and neuromuscular fatigue differ between high-intensity squats and deadlifts? And then research question 2 was: is the acute endocrine response, as measured by salivary testosterone and cortisol, different between high-intensity squats and deadlifts? So they used several different markers to look at fatigue in the study. The methods that were used in the study, the lifters who I kind of described earlier did 8 sets of 2 reps at 95% of their 1 rep max on the squat and the deadlift in a crossover design. So when you look at statistics, which I'm finishing up a statistics class right now, a crossover design is a crossover from one treatment to another during the course of the trial. So the lifters in this case that did the squat for 95% by 8 sets, they first did one exercise, and then all of the lifters, which there were only 10, so that's another variable in the study, they all did the deadlift program in subsequent weeks, I believe. Fatigue, which I mentioned earlier, in their monitoring system was done in several ways. One was by maximal voluntary isometric contraction of the knee extensors, central fatigue, and peripheral fatigue, voluntary activation, VA, surface electromyography, EMG, and control stimulus force, and then, as I mentioned, salivary testosterone and cortisol as endocrine responses. These were all assessed pre-training, 5 minutes post-training, and then 30 minutes post-training. So the subjects, I mentioned there were 10 of them. Their history of training was that they did 3 times or more times per week training for at least 2 years prior to the study being conducted. So I can post some of the graphs up, and then you, of course, can check this out at the MASS website. This is the magazine that's produced by Greg Knuckles, Eric Helms, and Mike Zordos, and they cover a lot of contemporary research on strength training that is relevant if you are interested in training, that kind of thing. So I can post up different things for you guys to look at, the way that they were done, but the overall training implications that were looked at, one notable difference that I noticed that I doubt was considered in the study was the way that the deadlifts were performed. When you do a squat, it involves both a concentric and eccentric loading portion of the lift, whereas on the deadlift there's only a concentric portion that's usually done, and then you kind of maybe not drop the barbell, but it's kind of lowered in a variably from lifter to lifter controlled manner. So if they were putting the barbell down in the deadlift in a very controlled, slow manner, kind of like they were squatting up and down, then I would guess that probably more fatigue would be generated. There would be more time under tension, so that would be a factor I feel to consider in this study. So more research obviously is needed to look at some of these other variables that were mentioned, like hypertrophy, to look at if they indicate that strength athletes like powerlifters, strongman competitors, and weightlifters could equally be served by distributing volume between the squat and the deadlift during high intensity phases of training. This study does not tell us if the lifters, if those lifts for higher reps would be equally useful during phases of training where reps are used in higher ranges. And then, so for me personally, I have been changing some of my training so that during general strength phases, I have a phase of training that includes front, back, and pause squats at a frequency of 5 times per week. That's 2 days where I do back squats, 2 days where I do front squats, and then 1 day where I do paused back squats. And then that is specific to being a weightlifter. So, if you're not a weightlifter, you may not utilize lifts like the front squat as much, or the pause squat may not be as relevant for you. And then those are generally 3 sets per day, and they range anywhere from 70 to 85% of my 1 rep max, and then the reps are somewhere between 2 and 8 reps. And that is a total of, during those strength phases, that would be 15 sets of squats during the week total, and then 6 sets of deadlifts. So total lower body work over the course of a week would be about 21 sets. That is notable. That's I find that training that way with spreading the volume out over the week is easier on my joints and easier to recover from. And then so that would be the first phase of training. During the second phase of training, I would be doing more of the deadlifts than the squats, so it would end up being 4 times per week pulling. So when I do these, another factor in my personal training as I go forward, if you kind of follow any of this, is that I pull differently than a deadlift. So the 2 pull variations that I primarily use are the clean pull and the snatch grip deadlift or snatch pull, and these are meant to carry over to the clean and to the snatch. That is a significant factor because with those you generally start with lower hips and there is less stress put on the initial pull on the lower back, which is, your central nervous system is your brain and your spine, which goes down, I think it ends somewhere around your thoracic spine, and then the lower parts of it are equine something, like kind of strands that come off to connect to those nerve endings down there. Nerve endings to the connections that, nerves that run down to your extremities. So by starting with lower hips, I probably am generating less fatigue in my spine than, or in my lower back than, most people that would deadlift with a higher hips. When I deadlift for like powerlifting, it is better to start with a little bit higher hips, not like a stiff leg deadlift, but somewhere between like a stiff leg deadlift and like the bottom of a squat is usually where most people break the bar off the floor for max deadlifts. So I'm just pointing out that for me personally, it is slightly different than most powerlifters at least. And then, so during that phase, it'll be 4 weeks, 4 times per week, 2 days where I do clean pulls, 2 days of snatch pulls, and then 3 days in the week will be squatting, 2 front squat days and 1 back squat day. So you can see that the total amount of sets will remain the same during those phases, but I will be doing, but there's just more of them will be distributed out to the deadlift than to the squat during that particular phase. So each one of those will be 4 weeks with 1 kind of unloading week. The difference very quickly between an unloading week and a deload week is that the unloading week, you kind of maintain some of the intensity within the rep range or RPE value if you're following rate of perceived exertion. Somewhat remains the same. It's just that the total intensity comes down by maybe 10% and the total volume over the course of the week is cut about in half. So you're doing maybe only 1 top set in a given rep range with no back off sets, or at most 1 back off set. So total amount of sets done in that week, instead of being 21 in my case, they would drop down to 10. So things to note for that and the way that I'm doing that is it does still overall favor squatting frequency more so than pulling. I mentioned that the pulls were done slightly differently. And then the last thing that I will mention is that for me personally, the squat or the snatch and the clean are both still utilized in my training, but they are maybe not as significant as they would be to better lifters like Clarence Kennedy or someone, or Ili Ilian. They can kind of rely specifically on the snatch and clean and jerk because they're so good at the lifts that they're using a very high percentage of what they can pull compared to what they are actually snatching or cleaning. So if I were in that scenario and as I go forward and improve how the technique and how I'm actually able to do the lifts, I may find that I end up either doing a lot less snatching and cleaning from the floor and end up relying more so on blocks and continue to follow the same type of programmatic ideas in terms of squatting and deadlifting, or I may actually just do a lot less squatting and deadlifting and rely more heavily on the classical lifts of the snatch and clean and jerk. I know that for like Clarence Kennedy, he's mentioned multiple times that he generally does better by relying more heavily on the squat and strength exercises and doing less frequency with the classical lifts. So those are all factors to consider in that. But That is it. You guys can read the study. If you've made it this far in the video, go ahead and click like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. And I'll post the link to the original study for you to look at in the description box below. You guys take it easy.